Now, before we'll output this response data in the UI, I first of all want to briefly show you that you could also configure this request by passing a second argument, a configuration object, to this get method, such that this next function is triggered with different data than the response data. You can configure this by setting the observe setting on this configuration object. And you can, for example, set this to response, even though my IDE does not give me that as a suggestion here. But response is one of the allowed values. If you do set this to response, Angular will trigger this next function not with the response data, but instead with the full response object. So response is a more fitting name for this parameter then. Now, this response object still has a body property which actually contains the response data, but this may now actually be null, simply because theoretically the response could of course not contain any body. That's why we need to add this question mark here to access this places property conditionally only if body is not null. So we can of course also log this entire response object here, and if I do so and I then reload, you'll see that after a short while this HTTP response object is being logged here, and that's an object that contains the body, the parsed body to be precise, but also headers, the information whether it's a success response, the exact status code and status text, and so on. Now, besides observing the response, you could also observe events. That's another supported setting. And if you do that, the next function will actually get triggered multiple times instead of just once, as it was previously the case. Because it will now get triggered for different events that occur during that request-response lifecycle. So here I'll log that event so that we get an idea for how often it is being triggered. And if I save that and I reload, you will see that we got one log right at the start, and then at some point also the response. So I got two logs here. Now, the first event is super simple, of course. That in the end is simply an event that's being emitted to tell us that the request was sent, you could say. And then at some point we got the response. But still, this now shows us that the next function is triggered multiple times, not just once. And if you're interested in performing different actions at different points of time during that request-response lifecycle, observing the events might be what you want to do. Now here I'll get rid of that though, and I'll go back to working with just the response data as we did before, but it's of course worth knowing about these alternative options. But with that, we can now finally make sure that these places are also shown on the screen. So let's now use those fetched places and output them in the template. For that, we can use this places signal, which already exists here in this component, and update it once the data is available. So what we can do here in this next function is we can use the places signal and call set on it to set it to some new data, and set it to the data that we find in the response data. Now, since we're dealing with an observable here, we could also get fancy and call pipe on the observable before we subscribe to add an operator to this observable chain here, so that we can, for example, transform the data that's emitted by the observable before it reaches the next function. Not something we necessarily need for this simple use case here, but something we can do for demo purposes. So for example, here we can use the map operator, which you already saw in the RxJS section, and import that from RxJS, and then call it here as an argument for the pipe function, and then pass a function to map, which will receive those emitted values, or in this case, this one emitted value, the response data as we know in the end. And then here I'll return response data places. So I'll convert this object that has the places key, which contains the array, to just the array. So that here in the next function, we get those places here, and we can use them like this, therefore. Again, that's not something we necessarily need to do here, but for demo and practice purposes, I'll add this operator to this observable chain. Well, and with that, we now should be updating the UI with the fetched data. So if you reload, after a short while, this should get populated with the places data, and that's looking good here. So that's now a big step into the right direction. Before we now continue working on this app and before we make sure that we can select places and then add them here to our favorites and store them on the backend, before we do that, I want to make sure that we show some fallback text whilst we're waiting for the data so that the user understands that something's happening, and I also want to handle potential errors. So we got this delay when we're fetching our places data, and it would be nice to show some fallback text or some loading spinner to the user whilst we're waiting for the places to arrive. And it turns out that this is fairly straightforward and simple to implement. Because one nice option we have here, one easy way of adding this feature, is that we add another signal, for example called isFetching, but the name is up to you, and set it to false initially, let's say. And then in ng-on-init, when we're about to send this request, so when we're about to start fetching data, we simply update isFetching and set it to true. And then we just want to make sure that we set it back to false once we're done. For that, we can also register a complete function here in our observer, because that complete function will run once this entire process is done, which is also the case, of course, in the next function, since only one value will be emitted here. But in case we would configure this request differently to emit multiple values or anything like that, we are safer if we use complete, because that's guaranteed to only run once the observable and therefore the request is done. So it's in this complete function where I now want to set isFetching back to false by calling the set method on the signal. And now all we have to do is go to our template, the available places component template file. And in there, I'm only rendering my app places if I have places, which is not the case initially because we start with undefined as an initial value. But we can now, in addition, also render some other conditional content with addIf, or with the ngIf directive if you're using an older version of Angular. But with addIf, we can check if isFetching is truthy, and if that's the case, then I want to output a paragraph with a class of fallback text where we could say fetching available places ... And you can of course output whatever you want here. And this should now be shown as long as we're waiting for the places data to arrive. So if we save that and reload, we see that text, but then after a while the places are there and we see those instead. And that's one quick and easy way of showing such a isFetching fallback state.